Here we have this thinking in the Second Temple period where the demons are the disembodied spirits of the dead giant clans. It leaks into the New Testament, so we've got a contradiction here between the Old and the New Testament. That's actually kind of nonsensical because you do find Rephaim in hell in the Old Testament. In Unseen Realm, you mentioned that this villain was cursed, eating dirt, and cast to the underworld. Do you believe that the Nephilim and the giant warrior kings are also in the underworld? This is really a good question because what we're going to see is that what happens in Genesis 3 is the first of three rebellions, supernatural rebellions in the Old Testament. And this frames pretty much everything else, after Genesis 11. And really, again, the spiritual warfare worldview, if you want to call it that. So one of those things is that when you look at them, you see that in Genesis 3, there's an original rebel. Again, this serpent figure. Genesis 3 uses the serpent terminology. And then we've got the sons of God, okay? And that really gets a little bit confusing because you have the sons of God and the daughters of men. All of the traditions, I would say, including the biblical traditions because of 2 Peter and Jude, have the original offending sons of God basically punished, sent to hell, sent to the abyss, okay? But the Nephilim come into this. Their offspring are not. They are not sent anywhere. Okay, they are, the offspring, the Nephilim, the Anakim, the Rephaim, all these terms. They are destroyed later, through, it takes a while, in biblical history. There's the conquest, there's the, Goliath with David and all that kind of stuff. So all of the traditions you'll find, are unanimous that when one of these was killed or destroyed, their disembodied spirit is what the Gospels call a demon. So the demons, as we know them from the gospel stories, are different than the sons of God who rebelled in Genesis 6. They're two different groups. One is imprisoned. The spirits in prison that Peter likes to refer to. Those are the original offending sons of God in Genesis 6. They are not the demons. The demons are something else that are derivative from those other guys. And so it raises a logical question. Well, a lot of critical scholars want to say, well, this is just, kind of strange. Here we have this thinking in the Second Temple period where the demons are the disembodied, spirits of the dead giant clans and all this kind of stuff. And that's kind of weird. It's new. It leaks into the New Testament, and you don't find this in the Old Testament. Isn't that, awful? And so, we've got a contradiction here between the Old and the New Testament. That's actually kind of nonsensical. Because if you're going to look at the Old Testament vocabulary for the giant clans, one of the umbrella terms is Rephaim, and you do find Rephaim in hell, as it were, in the abyss, in the Old Testament. This is the one of the Old Testament touch points for this later Jewish theology and this later New Testament theology. So it actually is in the Old Testament. You have passages like Ezekiel 32, Isaiah 14. Okay, you see references to the Rephaim in the underworld. So yeah, the answer to the question is yeah, and that's why. I think there's consistency here, and I don't really know why other scholars don't really see this and develop it or see it as part of the development, that this thinking has Old Testament roots, because it does. It very transparently does, if you're going to let the terminology be what it is. Now, outside the Old Testament, at Ugarit, for instance, this is where you get the Rephaim mentioned a lot in Canaanite literature. There, they are just, like warrior kings who have died and gone on to Sheol, the underworld. They're not giants. Well, great, wonderful. In the Old Testament, they are. And the reason that they are is, again, because all the giant stuff goes right back to Babel. if you understand the Apkallu story, the Mesopotamian backdrop to Genesis 6:1-4, this is why the two things are connected. The giant clans, the spawn with the demons. Okay, there's a reason these two things are connected, because the original Apkallu also, just like the fallen sons of God, are also in the abyss. I mean, there's a logic to this. It has its own logic on its own terms that is not at Ugarit, because the Ugaritic writers don't, they're not writing about the Apkallu story. They're not responding to it. It's not a polemic. What they write about the Rephaim has nothing to do with this polemic strategy. So that's why you don't get both there, and you do in the Old Testament. Honestly, it's not terribly complicated, but it's really one of these under-observed things that when the Demons book comes out, I go through all of that. In the Gospels, demons are referred to as unclean spirits. Now, there's actually been a dissertation on where does the term unclean spirits come from and what does it mean? Why would demons be called unclean spirits? Well, unclean spirits are called unclean because, let's ask ourselves this question. What's one of the major categories of uncleanness in Levitical thought? Forbidden mixtures. Forbidden mixtures. And that's what you've got here. They're also called bastard spirits in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Why the bastard spirits? Well, because that's what they are. So again, all of this has a certain logic that if you're familiar with the primary sources in the intertestamental period, you're going to be able to see the dots. And again, the Demons book will help you connect the dots.